Welcome to Fashion And with me, Scott Vionnet, Fashion Curator. Just a reminder that you can keep up to date with everything Fashion And, including the new Fashion And book club, by following @Fashion And with Scott Vionnet on Instagram and by hitting that subscribe button. This episode is dedicated to an architect among dressmakers. This is Fashion and Vionnet. If a woman smiles, her dress must also smile. Madeleine Vionnet was one of Europe's greatest couturiers, famous for pioneering the revolutionary bias cut and changing the shape of women's fashion. Referred to as an architect amongst dressmakers, Vionnet's chic, free-flowing garments flattered the curves and forms of the female body, encouraging women to abandon their cumbersome corsets. Madeleine Vionnet possessed an unrivaled technical knowledge of fabric and construction. Her bias-cut garments may have appeared simple, but their cut and construction were in fact complex and always immaculately executed. Vionnet's dresses had structures that had never been seen before, from their cut and type and uses of fabric to their decorations and stitching techniques. Each had a unique individuality. Rather than following the trends, Vionnet stayed on her own path, sticking to her own company ethos and couture vision. Due to her reserved nature, she may not have obtained the same attention as some of her contemporaries, but this can never discredit both the importance and relevance of Vionnet's work. In this episode, we will be exploring the life and work of Madeleine Vionnet through 4 themes: becoming Vionnet, the great geometrician, the modern classicist, and after Vionnet. Although Madeleine Vionnet was highly acclaimed throughout her lifetime and is regarded by fashion historians as one of the greatest designers of the 20th century, today she is not widely known. Madeleine Vionnet was born on the 22nd of June 1876 in Chilleray-Bois, Loiret. She moved to AUBERVILLIERS, a suburb north of Paris, at the age of 5, where she was raised by her working-class father. At the age of 11, she became apprenticed to a seamstress, and by the age of 19 was made première at Vincent et Cie, a small Parisian fashion house. After a brief marriage which ended in divorce and the loss of her young child, in 1895 Vionnet went to London, where she worked with fashionable society dressmaker Kate Riley, a company that copied Parisian originals. In 1900, at the age of 24 years old and with 12 years experience as a seamstress, Vionnet moved back to Paris. Upon her return, she visited the Universal Exhibition. Within the couture exhibit, Vionnet saw firsthand the work of Worth, Doucet and Paquin, designers she had copied during her time in London. But one couture house in particular caught her attention, the house of the Calosseurs. She became a great admirer of their work and in 1901 accepted a position there. After a disagreement with a manager of the house, Vionnet threatened to leave her post, but was convinced to stay by the eldest of the Calosseurs, Marie Callot-Gerber. Madame Gerber made Vionnet a première for the house, a promotion that would allow the young designer to improvise draped designs on a live model with Gerber herself. Without the example of the Calosseurs, I would have continued to make Fords. It is because of them that I've been able to make Rolls Royces. Catching the eye of famed couturier Jacques Doucet, in 1906 she left the Calosseurs and accepted a job at Maison Doucet as a designer or modeliste. Create a young house in this old house of Doucet. Do what you want. Vionnet started designing some of the first dresses without corsets. However, the vendeuses within the salons vehemently rejected her designs and refused to promote or sell them to their clients. Shortly after Vionnet debuted these styles, Paul Poiret showed dresses without corsets and, because of his unique talent for self-aggrandizement and publicity, was given credit for freeing women from their restraints. In 1912, tired of her designs being rejected and ridiculed by the vendeuses, Vionnet decided to venture out on her own, opening a small fashion house at number 22 Rue de Rivoli. Vionnet continued to produce gowns that were in keeping with the style of the day, but, now with aesthetic freedom, continued to evolve her innovative cutting skills. In 1914, with the outbreak of World War I, Vionnet temporarily closed her house. But as soon as the war was over, Vionnet reopened and was back in business. On the 15th of April 1923, Vionnet moved to new premises at number 50 Avenue Montaigne, which soon became hailed as the Temple of Fashion. The new salon was breathtaking. Light flooded the room, and in the pure Art Deco style, there were painted frescoes on the walls, silver relief friezes, and her signature rose decoration on the ceiling, all sculpted in crystal by RENÉ LALIQUE. When the beautifully dressed models stepped through the salon, the elegance of the room was complete. The House of Vionnet provided progressive terms of employment. She offered free lunches to her employees, gave coffee breaks and paid vacations, 1 week in winter and 3 weeks in the summer. Employees were permitted to buy her marked down items with even further reductions. She provided education and training to apprentices, free health care including a dental practice and a gym, and gave her female staff maternity leave. Throughout the 1930s, Vionnet's importance and influence grew. Her bias-cut gowns were admired and imitated, but her genius in construction was never equalled. Signatures of the house included handkerchief dresses, cowl necks and halter tops. Many of the garments were ingeniously constructed in one piece, without any fastenings. She was exceptional among couturiers of the time. Despite huge success and critical acclaim, Vionnet closed her namesake house in 1939. With such a successful and pioneering career, why is Vionnet, the great architect of couture, not as well known as Chanel, Poiret and Schiaparelli? The answer is in part because Vionnet was a shy woman who steered clear of the limelight. Unlike the great self-promoter Paul Poiret, Vionnet preferred her designs to do all the talking. But also because her designs, due to their unique and complicated cut and construction, were just too difficult to copy. The couturier should be a geometrician, for the human body makes geometrical figures to which the material should correspond. Madeleine Vionnet did not work from sketches, but with fabric on a miniature mannequin. Vionnet had an encyclopedic knowledge of fabrics. She used scissors to cut muslin, and she draped on her wooden artist mannequin to determine the details and shapes of garments. Once Vionnet was happy with her design, she would invite her team into her studio, who would then sketch the design on paper. I never learned sketching. I would not use this method. We should not dress with a pencil, but start using the fabric. In the 1920s, Vionnet disturbed the status quo by developing garments using the bias cut, a technique for cutting cloth diagonal to the grain of the fabric. Now, here comes the science part. Cloth is constructed by weaving the warp and the weft, known as the grain. The bias cut lies 45 degrees to the warp and weft threads. Therefore, when we refer to something as being cut on the bias, it means that the fabric's warp and weft threads are positioned at 45 degrees to the major seam lines of the garment. Now back to the programme. Although Vionnet did not invent the bias cut, it had been used in dressmaking for collars and bindings, etc. She was the first to use the bias cut to construct entire garments. Vionnet's bias cut created a sleek, flattering, body-skimming look that revolutionised women's clothing. As an expert couturier, Vionnet knew that textiles cut on the bias could be draped to match the curves of a woman's body. She used the cut to promote the potential for expression and motion, integrating comfort and movement as well as form into her designs. In the 1920s, Vionnet's designs were based on rectangular shapes and were cylindrical, but complicated in construction, sometimes with interlocking patchworked panels in contrasting lame fabrics, embroidered and beaded hexagonal panels. From around 1923, to prevent fraudulent copying of her designs, a practice Vionnet had a passionate distaste for, she would ink her right thumbprint onto her labels. In the 1930s, the bias cut she had used in the 20s began to dominate her designs. The majority of her gowns featured flared skirts and interesting seam arrangements, and incorporated scarves or ties that could be worn in different ways. Vionnet often placed seams in unexpected places. While these seams functioned structurally, they were sometimes decorations in themselves and often arranged in geometric patterns. Using her miniature wooden mannequin, Vionnet would, much like a potter, rotate the form as she draped and spiraled the fabric around the body, cutting, slashing and inserting geometric shapes. Vionnet's use of squares, triangles, circles and rectangles, all shapes found in the structure of three-dimensional Greek vases, helped to cement her reputation as the great geometrician and to define her philosophy of proportion, movement, balance and precision. Vionnet showed a deep interest in art, both past and present, from classical Greece to new styles of early 20th century art such as cubism and futurism. Vionnet was fascinated by Japanese ukiyo-e painting and kimonos, and collected them under the influence of Madame Gerber, whom she knew when working at the Calosur. In fact, many of her designs were influenced by the fluid lines of antique kimonos. The early 20th century fascination with exoticism was fueled by the many cultures that had started to reach Western Europe. Then referred to as Orientalism, the trend had continued on from the 1910s into the 20s, spurred by the discovery of Tutankhamun's tomb in 1922 and the craze for Mexican Aztec art. These so-called exotic influences were clearly visible in the fashion of the time, heavily promoted by designers such as Paul Poiret. Vionnet introduced classical Greek-inspired designs into the early 1920s. The designer would visit the Louvre regularly to study Greek vases, their construction and decoration. I like to look at old costumes and fashions of times gone by because of what they say about their times. They say so much about their era and the people in it. My inspiration comes from Greek vases, from the beautifully clothed women depicted on them. She studied ancient Greek sculpture, looking at the chiton, the chlamys and the peplos, studying their drapes, tucks and folds to create designs that were fluid, incorporating drapery to enhance the natural line of the body. Vionnet used chiffons, various crepes, satins, lace and velvets that, when cut on the bias and draped softly, were characteristic of classical silhouettes and were extremely light and easy to wear. She preferred solid coloured textiles because prints led the eye away from the shape and construction of the garment, which for Vionnet was the very essence of its design. During the 1930s, the designer experimented even more with classical style draping and folding, using elements of classical Greek dress long after the vogue for it had declined. She looked to the classical as a way to confirm her own concept of design, saying that her dresses were not for fashion, I only like that which lasts forever. Beneath the smooth lines of classically inspired clothing was a complex web of elaborate construction techniques. Vionnet's designs encapsulate the significance of classicism's influence on fashionable dress during the interwar period, pushing at the boundaries of fashion by testing the limits of the classical ideal. During this period, her designs also embodied the Art Deco era obsession with motion and modernism. Vionnet implemented all types of adornment into the function of the garment's construction: beadwork, cutwork, draping, fringing and applique. However, there was no improvisation. Every choice, every nuance served a purpose within the garment, either for structure, balance or to weigh a particular fold or drape. Vionnet's work gave women a sense of completeness, with body and cloth working in tandem to become one. Women felt confident in her designs, protected by layers of fluid fabric that caressed and freed their bodies. Vionnet created some 12,000 garments over the course of her career. However, at the outbreak of the Second World War in 1939, Madame Vionnet closed her couture house for good. Having always shunned the limelight, Madeleine Vionnet's name faded fast, but in the latter half of the 20th century she was rediscovered by fashion historians when in 1973 Diana Vreeland created an exhibition of French fashions entitled The 10s, 20s and 30s, Inventive Clothes in Paris from 1909 to 1939. Grouped alongside other early 20th century designers such as Chanel and Poiret, it was Madeleine Vionnet's star that shone the brightest, emerging as the true original of her time. Vionnet's pioneering bias cut and her refined approach to couture remained a strong and pervasive influence on fashion, as evidenced by the collections of designers past and present such as HALSTON, John Galliano, Azzedine Alaïa and Issey Miyake. In July 2006, Arnaud de Lumen, who acquired the company during the 1990s, announced the house's return to fashion. He promised not just a simple revival, but a unique and genuine approach to bring forward the Vionnet vision. The late Greek-born designer Sofia Kokosalaki was appointed creative director of the house, and her debut collection was launched for Spring-Summer 2007, the first Vionnet collection in 67 years. Kokosalaki designed only 2 collections for the house before being unexpectedly replaced by Marc Audibé, who himself did not last more than a few seasons. From 2008, Vionnet collaborated with numerous designers without revealing their identities. Arnaud de Lumen told Women's Wear Daily, "Vionnet doesn't need to be associated with a designer's name, it's an institution." Subsequently, the label was sold on to other investors and headed by many other designers, including Hussein Chalayan. However, much like other historical fashion house revivals such as Worth and Poiret, their success has never been matched. In 2018, the label went into voluntary liquidation, its Spring 2019 ready-to-wear collection being its last presentation. Evidence that the House of Vionnet was incapable of reviving its glory days due to a confused view of its own heritage and DNA. Although Madeleine Vionnet was highly acclaimed throughout her lifetime and is regarded by fashion historians as one of the greatest and most influential fashion designers of the 20th century, today she is largely unknown. Vionet's designs drew from the past but always looked to the future. Famous for pioneering the revolutionary bias cut and changing the shape of women's fashion, she was referred to as an architect among dressmakers. Madeleine Vionnet possessed an unrivaled technical knowledge of fabric and construction. Preempting the elimination of the corset, Vionnet's chic, free-flowing garments flattered the curves and forms of the female body. Due to her reserved nature, she may not have obtained the same attention as some of her contemporaries, but this can never discredit both the importance and relevance of Vionnet's work. Rather than following the trends, Vionnet stayed on her own path, sticking to her unique company ethos and unique vision of haute couture. That's it for the pioneering modern classicism of fashion and Vionnet. I'll see you next time, but before you go, don't forget to subscribe to Fashion And with me, Scott Schiavone, Fashion Curator.